Broken economic models for humanity. In this talk, I cover some of the toxic items of game theory, economics, and magical thinking that are occurring currently in technology, mostly in America. And my name is Noah Gift. Let's go ahead and get started with the key topics. First up, we have surveillance capitalism, which is a term that was created by Shoshana Zuboff in her famous book about the topic. She says, a parasitic economic logic in which the production of goods and services is subordinated to a new global architecture of behavioral modification. So she goes on to talk about some of the examples of this. And really the originator is Google, and then other big tech companies have copied, but it's a new economic order and it uses human experiences as the raw material. So blog posts, selfies, behavioral data. It also extracts, it predicts, and it sells data. The global architecture itself then starts to control production. It also concentrates wealth, knowledge, and power. So we're seeing that there's a large income inequality in America, and that's partially in part with the surveillance capitalism model. We also have a threat to human nature, like industrial capitalism threatened nature previously, and this new power dominates society. And so it is a very big challenge for democracy through, misinformation, disinformation. It also aims for total certainty and control, and it takes rights from the people like a coup, but from above. And this is a very terrifying aspect of surveillance capitalism that we'll get into in a little bit more detail. So some of the potential solutions could be that we have externality first capitalism instead. And this would be creating markets for social good. And this doesn't lean into communism or socialism or any of those isms. It's more taking the market itself and tweaking it so that we can optimize for the best outcome for humans, not just for corporations. You can see some examples like carbon pricing could be baked into a service. So for example, if it takes 3 bottles of water to make 100 words in generative AI, that could be priced into the service as a tax. We could look at media platforms being taxed according to the neutral facts as a percentage of the content. So if a platform is producing 80% of their content that's non-fact based, maybe there's an 80% tax on the profits. Tax credits for repairable technology as well. So we see that much of the economy in the United States is geared towards destruction, recreation. But if we have repairable technology, that's going to limit the amount of waste that we're producing. Also, addictive technology could be taxed at a different ratio, or if there's an addictiveness ratio itself that we could determine a tax based on that ratio. Also, corporate and individual wealth tax. This could be a great way to deconcentrate the exponential aspects of wealth in a digital age. The right to repair could also destroy upgrade cycles. So, making it a law that you must build repairable electronic items like laptops or phones. And you could also tax the externality by the impact. So an example would be if short-term housing is a startup that is creating revenue, then you could create a tax on the homelessness that is actually created as a result of that, eventually potentially reaching an equilibrium where there is no homelessness because you've taxed that short-term housing at a high enough rate. Also, the tax credits could be for employee ownership percentage as well. I think this is an interesting way to think about using capitalism for good, which is you still encourage individual effort, you still encourage entrepreneurship, but you actually cap the amount of the entrepreneurship value that goes to the owner only, and you make the employees a percentage owner. Now, if we look at game theory, the tragedy of the commons scenario is a very common game theory strategy, and we see this with generative AI, that the incentives are wrong for generative AI. And part of it is that the internet is a commons. It's like a public park. And if the internet is no longer a public commons, what do? Well, part of it is that the data collection without consent is part of the problem. Also, data collected without attribution, and also data collected without some kind of profit sharing partnership is going to destroy the commons because there's no incentive to continue to create great art, to create great writing, to create great source code. And it's a lot like a cattle rancher or a series of cattle ranchers that are given unlimited access to graze on a national park. Eventually, there's no grass left because they're all taking advantage of that natural resource. So ultimately, the in scenario here from a game theory perspective is that there is going to be no incentive to create art again. And who wants to live in that kind of world? We also see that privacy is power. In an excellent book by Carissa Veliz talks about this particular aspect, that it's too late to prevent the data economy from developing in the first place, but it's not too late to reclaim our privacy. Our civil liberties are at stake. And I think it's a very important point that she makes. And she goes on to say several other points in her book. Privacy is power. One is that data itself is power. So we need to protect data because it's a source of power, and we need to have different rules around this. In fact, I would argue that we should have deeper protections for individuals and their data, and that data belongs to the individual. Also, privacy is going to protect freedom. So the more privacy you have, the more freedom you're going to have in society. And that consent, the way it's done currently, is often meaningless because it's so complex, right? There's thousands and thousands of pages of different terms of services. And so, in fact, there is no real consent. It's actually your data is being taken from you. And data collection itself, she goes on to say, is something that harms society. So just the act itself of data collection. Finally, what can you do is you can take action, right? You can go to your local representatives and you tell them that data collection is something that you want protection from, and that the surveillance economy itself is something that you're concerned about. There's another corollary to this that's related, is that if, as Bruce Schneider says, that data itself is a toxic element to security, and that the more data you have, the more scary it is for your organization, you can infer something called the law of large data breaches. And what this means is that eventually, over a long enough time horizon, some subset of data stored online is breached. So what it means is that, for example, Social Security numbers, every single human in the United States has had their Social Security number breached. And you could say that that's a subset of the data stored online, and it's been breached. And eventually, given enough time horizon, potentially all data that ever exists will be breached, just because it's the nature of online data. We haven't broken that pattern yet. So what this means is that data potentially is something that you should think about more like nuclear waste versus a positive element to store. And finally, if we really wrap things up here about, there's lots of utopianism and optimism about all the different things that we've done. But if we look at the data, right, from a data science perspective about what's happened in America, we see there's actually not a great story here from a numerical standpoint. We look at the income inequality here of the low 50%, the 50 to 90%, the 90 to 98%. You see that essentially very minimal growth from 1960 to 2018. But the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%, we've got exponential changes here. And so this cannot continue, or else we're going to have a very warped society. And so when someone says we need to keep doing innovation or continue to grow, et cetera, you have to question from a critical thinking perspective, what do you mean? Do you mean you want even more income inequality and that's a good thing? Or do we want to change things up or optimize so that there's a better distribution for most humans? And if we look at, in fact, another data science endpoint here, and we say that Americans themselves are really suffering from this kind of business climate, and that Americans, according to the Commonwealth Fund analysis, show that they have the shortest lives, they have the most avoidable deaths. So what is happening here? Why is it that we have this problem in America? It could be that it's the business climate itself. And so to conclude, we need to optimize for humans. And this means that humans should come first, not technology. And if we look at some of the things that you hear from big tech companies or different segments of venture capital, they talk about growth. But again, if we go back to looking at income inequality, why do we want to continue what we're doing? Shouldn't we be thinking about stabilizing or diminishing what's happening? And so if we look at rapid growth, it's an anti-pattern. We look at addiction to technology, it's an anti-pattern. We look at income inequality, it's an anti-pattern. Centralized systems are an anti-pattern. Monopolies, social platforms, big tech, any kind of centralized system that has all the control, or communism, right? They're all systems where there's an authoritarian regime that controls everything. Also, the most important KPI is going to be welfare of most humans, not a few humans. And some simple classifications that you hear a lot to distract, like socialism, communism, capitalism, it's not really helpful versus humanism. What do we do to help humans? And there could be a combination of lots of different techniques. And if we look at continuously improving the human well-being, that's actually a much more important standpoint than the GDP, because as we see, the GDP could go up, but it's not equally distributed. The environment is also where humans live, and so we have to protect it from global warming, from toxic waste. And so these are the things that we really should be optimizing for when we think about technology, is that more data, more AI. This isn't really the optimization or more GDP. It's more welfare for humans. And this is part of thinking differently about AI, and also thinking in a radical way about AI in terms of how can I benefit a new technology towards humans, not how can I benefit the existing infrastructure and continue to grow it when we know that there's a problem with that particular architecture.